Everyone thinks Aztecs and Incas were basically the same thing. Two ancient empires and funny hats that built pyramids and got conquered by Spain. That's about as wrong as saying New York and Tokyo are the same because they both have tall buildings. These civilizations were so different that if they had somehow met, they wouldn't have even understood each other's economies. The Aztecs built their capital on a lake. Not next to a lake, on a lake. Tenochtitlan sat on an island in the middle of what's now Mexico City, and when Spanish conquistadors first saw it in 1519, they thought they were hallucinating. Imagine Venice, but 3 times bigger and in the middle of a mountain valley. Causeways connected the island to the mainland, canals ran between neighborhoods, and the whole city was designed around water. The Aztecs didn't just live with the lake, they turned it into their superpower. The craziest part was how they grew food. Aztec farmers built chinampas, which were basically artificial islands in the shallow parts of the lake. They drive wooden stakes into the lake bed, weave branches between them, pile on mud and vegetation, and create these insanely productive garden plots surrounded by water. Some people call them floating gardens, but they were actually anchored. These things produced multiple harvests per year: tomatoes, corn, beans, flowers, you name it. Canoes loaded with produce constantly moved through the canals toward the massive central market. The Aztecs turned a swampy lake that most civilizations would have drained into the foundation of their entire empire. Now jump south about 3,000 miles. The Incas are starting at the Andes Mountains, the second highest mountain range on Earth, with peaks over 20,000 feet. No lakes to farm, no flatland, just mountains, deserts, tropical forests, and cliffs that drop straight down for thousands of feet. A normal civilization would have said this is impossible. The Incas said, "Hold my chicha," and became the greatest mountain engineers in human history. They carved farms into mountains. These weren't just terraces like you'd see in a backyard. The Incas built stepped platforms up impossible slopes, some over 10 feet tall, with stone retaining walls and drainage systems that are still working 600 years later. These terraces, called andenes, created microclimates. The bottom terrace might be warm enough for corn, while the top terrace grows potatoes in the cold. Places like Machu Picchu have hundreds of these terraces stacked up the mountainside, all fed by stone water channels that never miss. The engineering is so precise that modern architects still study it. But here's what really blows your mind. The Incas built a road system that makes the U.S. interstate highway system look lazy. The Capacnan covered over 18,000 miles of engineered roads through some of the most brutal terrain on the planet. Stone stairways up sheer cliffs. Suspension bridges made of woven grass that hung over canyons hundreds of feet deep. Raised causeways through swamps. These weren't dirt paths where you hope for the best. The Incas built proper roads with drainage, retaining walls, and way stations every 15 miles stocked with food and supplies. They moved armies, goods, and messages across this network faster than most medieval European kingdoms could manage on flat ground. Here's where it gets wild. These two empires ran on completely different operating systems. The Aztecs built what historians call a hegemonic confederation. That's fancy talk for an empire that said, "We're not going to micromanage you, just pay up and shut up." The Aztec Empire was called the Triple Alliance, led by 3 cities with Tenochtitlan as the big boss. They conquered hundreds of smaller city-states across central Mexico, but they didn't usually replace local rulers or reorganize how things worked. They'd show up with an army, wreck anyone who resisted, and then tell the local king exactly how much tribute he owed. The tribute lists are insane. Cotton cloth, cocoa beans for making chocolate, jade, feathers from tropical birds, corn, warriors for military campaigns, and prisoners for sacrifice. The Codex Mendoza, the pictorial book made right after the conquest, lists everything in detail. One province owes 2,000 cotton cloaks and 400 warrior costumes. Another owes 20 bowls of gold dust and 800 bundles of feathers. As long as the tribute kept flowing and you showed up when they called for war, the Aztecs mostly left you alone. It was like a protection racket scaled up to empire size. The Incas did the exact opposite. They built an administrative empire that actually reorganized everything they conquered. The empire was called Tawantinsuyu, the realm of 4 parts divided into 4 massive regions. Each region had governors, sub-governors, and a whole bureaucratic hierarchy reporting back to the emperor in Cusco. But the Incas didn't just shuffle bureaucrats, They physically moved people around. The policy called mitma could relocate thousands of families at a time. Conquered a rebellious region? Move in 10,000 loyal families to outnumber the locals. Need workers for a mining project? Relocate an entire community. Need farmers in a strategic valley? Move them there. It sounds brutal, and it could be, but it also meant the Inca state directly controlled production across the entire territory. The economic difference is even more fundamental. The Aztec economy ran on markets, and we're not talking about some rinky-dink farmer's market. The market at Tlatelolco was one of the largest in the world. Spanish conquistadors estimated 60,000 people showed up on major market days. Thousands of canoes arrived loaded with goods. The market had specialized sections for pottery, jade, obsidian, food, textiles, and live animals. Market judges walked around settling disputes and checking that merchants weren't selling fake jade or underweight corn. Professional merchants called Pocteca organized trade caravans that lasted over a year, bringing luxury goods from provinces hundreds of miles away. The Aztecs even had money. For small purchases, people used cocoa beans. The same beans you make chocolate from had a recognized value. Spanish sources say a turkey cost about 10 cocoa beans. For big purchases, people used standardized cotton cloaks. These weren't coins, but they functioned as commodity money. Everyone knew the value and would accept them in trade. Markets operated every day, with certain days drawing bigger crowds, and this is where regular people bought and sold almost everything. The Inca economy was based on something totally different: redistribution and labor taxes. Markets existed in the Andes, but they weren't how the economy worked. Instead, the Inca state taxed people in labor, not goods. This system, called mita, required every able-bodied person to work for the state. You might spend months working state farmlands, building roads, serving in the army, or mining. In return, the state fed you, clothed you, and stored massive surpluses to redistribute when your community faced a bad harvest. The archaeological evidence is ridiculous. At one Inca administrative center called Huánuco Pampa, archaeologists counted hundreds of storage buildings covering the hillsides. At another site, over 1,000 storehouses. These weren't garden sheds. They were engineered warehouses positioned to catch wind and stay dry, filled with freeze-dried potatoes, dried meat, corn, textiles, weapons, everything. The Incas didn't need merchants or money because the state directly organized production and moved goods where they were needed through the road system. Scholars literally say that while markets were basic institutions in Mesoamerica, they don't appear to have been so in the Andes. These civilizations organized their entire economies on opposite principles. Now let's talk about record keeping, because this is where things get really weird. The Aztecs painted books, not books with an alphabet like we use, but codices with pictures and symbols that encoded information. Trained scribes could record tribute lists, ritual calendars, historical events, and genealogies using this system. The Codex Mendoza shows exactly what each province owed with little illustrations. 400 warriors dressed like jaguars, 2,000 cloaks, 20 bowls of gold dust. Other codices recorded their religious calendar, which was so complex it needed 2 different cycles running at the same time. The Incas had 0 books, no paper, no manuscripts, nothing written down. For decades, historians assumed they had no way to keep records, which seemed impossible for an empire controlling 10 million people. Then people started really studying the quipu. A quipu looks like a bundle of knotted strings hanging from a main cord. Different colors, different types of knots, different positions along the string, it all means something. We know for certain that quipu recorded numbers. An Inca bureaucrat could use a quipu to track census data, labor obligations, warehouse inventories, and troop counts. Multiple officials kept independent quipu that could be cross-checked for accuracy. The Incas ran a paperless bureaucracy across thousands of miles using knotted strings. The debate now is whether quipu also encoded language, like actual words and sentences. Some researchers think they might be a form of 3-dimensional writing we haven't cracked yet. Others are skeptical. Either way, the system worked. The Spanish actually used Inca quipu records when they first took over because they were more accurate than anything the conquistadors could create. Religious practice shows another massive difference. Both civilizations practiced human sacrifice, but the scale was wildly different. For the Aztecs, sacrifice was everywhere. Their cosmology taught that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and humans owed a blood debt. Major festivals throughout the year involved sacrifices at the top of temple pyramids. Warriors specifically tried to capture enemies alive to bring back for sacrifice. The Templo Mayor, the Great Pyramid in downtown Tenochtitlan, was the main stage. Spanish chroniclers reported seeing skull racks with thousands of skulls on display. Archaeologists excavating the Templo Mayor have found massive offering pits with human remains, jaguar skeletons, eagle bones, and artifacts from across the empire. The Incas sacrificed too, but it was rarer and served different purposes. The most famous Inca practice is capacocha, where specially chosen children, usually from noble families, were taken on pilgrimages to high mountain shrines and sacrificed. These weren't frequent events. They marked major occasions like the death of an emperor or natural disasters. The children were treated as sacred, given fine clothes and elaborate offerings. Their bodies, preserved by the extreme cold and dry air at high altitude, have been found by archaeologists. The Yuyayaco mummies, 3 children found at over 22,000 feet, are some of the best preserved ancient bodies ever discovered. But daily Inca religious life centered more on offerings, state rituals, and maintaining relationships with deities than on blood sacrifice. Communication systems were completely different too. The Aztecs relied on their merchant class to move information. The Pochteca weren't just traders. They formed hereditary guilds with their own neighborhoods and laws. They traveled in armed caravans to distant provinces, brought back exotic goods, and reported on political conditions. Pochteca sometimes worked as spies. The empire also used runners to carry messages, and literate scribes could send codices with encoded information. The Incas created a relay runner system that's honestly more impressive than anything in the ancient Mediterranean world. Messengers called chasquis were stationed at rest stops along the Chapacnan. When a message needed to go from Cusco to a distant province, a chasqui would run full speed to the next station and hand off the message to the next runner. This relay operated 24/7. Messages could travel hundreds of miles in a few days through mountain terrain where a normal person would be gasping for air. The system also moved small valuable items. Spanish chroniclers were amazed that the empire in Cusco could eat fresh fish from the coast, delivered by relay runners who covered over 150 miles in less than 2 days. The urban experience was night and day different. Tenochtitlan was one of the 5 largest cities in the world in 1500, with somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 people crammed onto an island. The city was organized into neighborhoods, each with its own temple and leadership. Causeways with removable wooden bridges connected to shore, canals served as streets for canoe traffic. The ceremonial center, topped by the twin temples of the war god and rain god, anchored everything. When the Spanish laid siege in 1521 and destroyed Tenochtitlan, the entire Aztec political system collapsed because it all ran through that one urban center. Cusco was totally different. It sat high in the Andes, a planned city with stone buildings and paved streets. The most impressive structures used ashlar masonry, where massive stone blocks were cut so precisely they fit together without mortar. You can't slip a knife blade between stones. The Temple of the Sun was supposedly covered in gold before the Spanish looted it. But here's the thing, Cusco was important, but the Inca Empire wasn't as dependent on a single city. The Incas built planned administrative centers throughout their territory, regional hubs with plazas, office buildings, and those massive storehouse complexes. Machu Picchu, probably a royal estate, shows what Inca architecture could do with terraces, stone buildings, and water systems integrated into a mountain ridge. Warfare worked differently too. The Aztecs fought seasonal campaigns timed around farming. Soldiers came from their home neighborhoods led by elite warriors from orders like the Eagle and Jaguar warriors who wore elaborate costumes. Aztec warfare focused heavily on capturing enemies alive for sacrifice, which sometimes meant taking risks a purely tactical army wouldn't. Their main weapon was the macahuitl, a wooden club with obsidian blades embedded in the edges. Obsidian is volcanic glass that can be sharper than steel, though more brittle. These things could deliver devastating wounds. They also used atlatls, spear throwers that gave extra force, and bows. The Incas mobilized armies through their labor tax system. Every province had to provide soldiers when called. Inca armies could be enormous, bringing together ethnic groups from across the empire under imperial command. They used slings that could hurl stones with brutal accuracy, plus maces, axes, and spears. They had bronze tools and weapons, giving them a slight edge in some situations. But the Incas' real advantage was logistics. They could move armies along the road network, house them in way stations, feed them from state warehouses, and coordinate attacks across their massive territory. They also built fortresses at strategic points, some with walls and towers that still stand today. Language policy shows another contrast. Nahuatl, the Aztec language, was already prestigious in central Mexico. The Triple Alliance reinforced its dominance for administration and literature, but didn't necessarily force conquered people to stop speaking their own languages. Millions still speak Nahuatl today in Mexico. The Incas actively spread Quechua as an administrative language. Quechua existed before the Incas, but they promoted it as part of their conquest strategy. Local elites who learned Quechua and worked with the imperial system gained privileges. The language became essential for anyone dealing with the bureaucracy. Quechua is now spoken by millions across Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. The Aztec calendar system was one of the most sophisticated timekeeping systems in the ancient world. They used two interlocking calendars. The ritual calendar had 260 days divided into 20 periods of 13 days. The solar calendar had 365 days and 18 months of 20 days, plus 5 unlucky days at the end. These two calendars meshed like gears. Any given day had two names, one from each calendar. The full cycle repeated every 52 years, a sacred period that ended with massive renewal ceremonies. Priests used these calendars to determine lucky and unlucky days, schedule rituals, and name children. The Inca calendar is frustratingly unclear. Spanish sources say the Incas marked solstices and equinoxes with stone towers around Cusco. They may have used a 12-month lunar calendar adjusted to solar years. But different regions possibly use different systems. Honestly, we just don't know much. This isn't because the Incas were less advanced. They didn't leave written records and the Spanish didn't document their timekeeping thoroughly. Here's where these different systems mattered most: when they collapsed. The Aztec Empire fell with shocking speed. Hernan Cortez landed in 1519 with a few hundred men. He quickly realized the empire was full of city-states that hated Aztec rule. The Tlaxcalans, who had resisted the Aztecs for generations, allied with Cortez and provided thousands of warriors. Other cities joined, then smallpox hit. The disease had never existed in the Americas, so no one had immunity. People died in horrifying numbers. Emperor Cuitlahuac died of smallpox. When Cortez returned to besiege Tenochtitlan, he built ships that let his forces control the lake and cut off supplies. The siege lasted 75 days. By August 13, 1521, the Aztec Empire was done. The fall of Tenochtitlan meant the fall of everything because the hegemonic system depended on that capital's power. The Inca collapse took longer and started differently. Epidemic disease reached the Andes before the Spanish, spreading through indigenous trade networks. The epidemic killed Emperor Huayna Capac and his heir around 1527, triggering a succession war between two of his sons. When Francisco Pizarro arrived in 1532 with 170 men, the empire was already fractured from civil war. At Cajamarca, Pizarro ambushed and captured the Emperor Atahualpa. Even after Atahualpa paid a ransom that filled a room with gold, Pizarro executed him. But the Inca Empire didn't end there. Resistance continued for decades. A neo-Inca state held out in a remote mountain fortress until 1572. The Inca system, being more spread out and less dependent on one capital, took longer to die. So here's the bottom line. Both empires achieved incredible things without iron tools, steel weapons, wheeled vehicles, or draft animals. Both fed millions, built monumental cities, and conquered vast territories. But they did it through fundamentally different strategies. The Aztecs optimized for their lake basin, building on Mesoamerica's traditions of cities, markets, and writing. They created a confederation that extracted tribute through subject city-states, used markets and merchants to move goods, and staged power through public religious spectacles. The Incas optimized for mountains, building on Andean traditions of communal labor and redistribution. They created an administrative empire that reorganized populations, extracted labor instead of goods, and used roads and storehouses to redistribute resources. Neither was primitive. They were different solutions to different problems, and both worked brilliantly until diseases and technologies from another hemisphere destroyed them. These weren't just two empires that happened to exist before Columbus. They represent two of the most distinct paths to power humans have ever created, shaped by different geographies, histories, and choices about organizing millions of people across thousands of miles. That's the actual difference between the Inca and Aztec empires.